Welcome everyone to the Vashon Heritage Museum Talk. Tonight's topic is Poet Laureates, the importance of poetry in a small community. I'm your host, Chris Austin, a board member of the Heritage Museum. And as a reminder, your microphones will be muted during the talk. But if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat function and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. I would like to recognize and thank For Culture for sponsoring the Museum Talk series. At this time, I'd like to recognize the first Vashon Native people and read the land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands and traditional home of the Shrobops, Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was our home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers arrived. The Shrobops were forcibly removed from these lands and relocated onto neighboring reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. Vashon Island is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor the island itself and the Shrobops people, past and present. I'd also like to present you with the Vashon Heritage Museum Inclusion Pledge. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. But before we begin, I'd like to encourage you to join us in the March talk when we have Vashon birds, past, present, and future. Adria McGrath, will moderate a panel discussion with Ed Swan and Raina Holtz on how human impacts through changes in land use and climate change have affected Vashon bird populations for the past 150 years. And in April, we invite local pottery artists to talk about the history of Vashon pottery. Tonight's talk, as we said, is Vashon Poet Laureates, the importance of poetry in the life of a small community. Our discussion will provide a perspective on poetry on the island, how it has developed and changed over the years, and how it has again come to play an increasingly visible and important role on the island. And now I would like to introduce tonight's moderator, Tom Amorose. Tom is a professor of English and Cultural Studies at Seattle Pacific University. He teaches early English literature and researches the rhetoric on public values, including environmental values. Tom will introduce tonight's poets, Ann Spiers and Sandra Noel. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much, Chris. It's a delight to be with you and subbing in as a moderator for this delightful program. I'd like to introduce our two speakers, panelists now, and really ask them a few questions along the way. Chris has assured me that if you have questions or would like to bring up things, you can do so in the chat room, if I've got that right, Chris. And at the end of our session, there'll be time for the poets to answer some of those questions. So let's start with Ann. Ann Spiers was the inaugural Poet Laureate of Vashon Island. She served as Vashon Audubon president and as the Land Trust staff overseeing volunteer stewards in compiling property baselines. She stewards the Vashon Poetry Post in the Village Green. She writes signage for Vashon's many conservation parks. For almost 30 years, she's met with friends at Mondays at 3 to share haiku. Her 2021-2022 poetry books include Rain Violent from Empty Bowl, Back Cut from Black Heron, and Harpoon, Ravenna Triple Series. And you can see her website, annspiers.com, for more. Sandra, our second poet this evening, Sandra Noel works as a freelance illustrator and graphic designer, developing environmental education posters, brochures, exhibits, and interpretive signs. She is Poet Laureate for Vashon Island currently for the years 2021 through 23. Her poems have appeared in Buddhist Poetry Review, Elohai Gaduji Journal, and other journals. Chapbooks include The Gypsy in My Kitchen and Into the Green from Finishing Line Press, The River from Kelsey Press, unraveling the endless knot from Middle Crease Publishing and Audio, and a full-length poetry book, Love Island, from Goldfish Press. You can find out more information about Sandra from her website, www.noeldesigninterp.com. So I guess I'd like to start by passing things over to Anne and ask Anne to give us a little background, start to define the Poet Laureate program on Vashon, and how it originated and how poets laureate are chosen. So Anne, I'm passing it over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chris. Well, it all started in front of the Vashon Pharmacy. I had been avoiding Ron Irvin for years because he would see me at Thriftway or wherever and say, "Don't you want to be Poet Laureate?" I go, "No, no, no, no. I just want to write some poems. That's all I want." Well, the first Poetry Fest was coming up, and yes, he was in his car. He drove, he got on his brake, and he says, "Anne, do you want to be Poet Laureate?" And I thought, "Okay, I will. No duties." And he says, "Okay," and off he drove. So I became Poet Laureate, and in 2011, and I was privately pleased, of course. And also, I found as I went off island, they would say, "Well, who are you? What do you do?" And I go, "Well, I'm the Poet Laureate of Vashon Island." And people perked up and were so pleased with the whole idea. And since then, in the last 20 years, Poet Laureates in counties, there's a Poet Laureate of every county, I swear, city, art center, school. Poet Laureates have sort of risen as a person within a community that is recognized as being a poet. And my understanding of that role has grown. However, yes, it is an honor. And when you're chosen to be a Poet Laureate, one thing you do sign up for is that you're a public figure, even if they're just passing you at the four-way stop in Vashon Island town. When Poet Laureates have signed on every 2 years, they usually form their own agendas. Everything from showing up for their inauguration poetry reading to working with the schools, having poetry reading series, collaborating with other art groups on the island. It's totally up to them. There are no duties. This is an honor. There's also no money. And so how are they selected? Well, Ron told me that I couldn't be on the selection committee, even though I ended up being on the selection committee eventually. It's usually 4 or 5 people who are aware of the program and the past laureates and have the attitude that we have to keep reaching out and just not pick each other. So, which came to be very apparent when we gave one of our inauguration readings and someone raised their hand and said, "Could you tell us how you get picked?" And so since then, when we're moving towards the meeting where we pick a Vashon Island poet, we put articles, calls for applications in the Beachcomber, and Sandra will tell us if we have a very long email list, and Sandra could talk about that later. And I have a magic email list too. So the last time we got maybe about 13, 14 applications. People nominate themselves, which is great. And sometimes friends nominate poets. Sometimes the poets know about it. So when you call and you're real sorry they didn't make it, they said, "Oh, I didn't know I was nominated." So it's become more public. And what I want to say about arts, and well, just living on Vashon Island, and maybe it's that way in every community, is that a program like the Poet Laureate, they usually, anything that happens out in the community usually can start with one person and they carry it all the way through. Another thing is that it can be a group, someone says, should we, and a group forms. And the other way is to approach a formal arts agency and say, will you be our umbrella? And what that means is that you can apply for grants and use that arts agency as your umbrella. They probably receive the money and make sure that it's spent well. And or an arts agency can say, oh, we are going to take over the Poet Laureate program. And then you become a program with their other programs. So far, this is the Poet Laureate group is a group, and we sort of remind ourselves it's time to meet. So the past Poet Laureates after me was Ina Whitlock, Cal Kinnear, and Lonnie Kaneko, two wonderful poets, gentlemen, shared those 2 years. Myrna Hecht, Susan Lynch, and now Sandra Noel. And I'll talk about, as a way to segue to Sandra, I want to talk about what it was like to put together Sandra's inauguration reading. It was deep COVID, or it had just moved over where maybe you could meet with a few people someplace outside, 6 feet spacing and all the rest of that. Well, we usually have it at the Vashon Winery, Ron Irvin's winery, and they've been outside, spectacular. But I went to the Snapdragon, and they said, in good Vashon manner, yes, backyard. And I said, well, I want a cake. So we were in the patio in the back. Everybody had a mask. Everybody that was not within a family group spaced themselves. Luckily, because the wind, it was evening, the wind was just whipping through over our heads through the alder trees. I did find at least a 1946 amp and mic, and so we mic'd it. And 36 people showed up. And I was just, I mean, especially in the depths of COVID. And I thought, oh, this is such a tribute to the idea of poetry on Vashon Island, to the program, but also to Sandra Noel. And so I want to thank Snapdragon, but also Home Sweet Home, who showed me where to plug in the amp and where the cake was. So Sandra.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Yeah, we did have cake, so it wasn't just me. Yeah, being Poet Laureate was a big surprise. Susan Lynch called me, and I had no idea why. And she showed up at my house and told me. So it was a big surprise, and I felt very honored because the people that are poets on this island, I have a great deal of respect for, especially Anne. I love her books. I have them all, especially Backcut. This last one, I need it signed later.
Okay.
What we're doing now, when I first came into this, I was trying to think of a way where the poets on the island could get together and still read. We used to do that at the bookstore, and something that was done a while back when Susan Lynch was Poet Laureate was to have jazz and poetry, which was great. Well, none of that can happen now. So the first thing we did was Voice of Vashon stepped right up and offered us the spot to do poetry on the radio. And Jim Marsh, one of their engineers, wonderfully agreed to bring us all in on a Sunday and rounded up all 11 poets and without any bloodshed at all. And we got through it. And it is now available for everybody to listen to on Voice of Vashon. You just go to their site and find Vashon Poetry Project, and you can check out that link and all the poetry on there. Another project, and one that was on a list of ideas I'll get to in a minute from the party, the Poet Laureate get together, was to have people get together for open mic. Well, we can't do that in person. So Myrna Hecht stepped up, who has a Zoom account, and said, I'll do it. And so far we've had 3 of them, one a month, and we're doing another one in February where poets sign up. We can do about a 10 to 11 in a 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock period. And the next one's February 16th. So we usually fill up pretty quick. And we're almost full for this next one.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, one of the joys of this open mic is you actually see poets you've never seen on the street or heard. And that is just opening up our views of both the content and the style of both the writing itself, but also the presentation. So
Yes,
thank you.
indeed. It's been a really great group. So at that get together, we had a list of things. We asked people later to have some ideas and suggestions to what we could do with poetry in the community on Vashon. And I'll just briefly go through these. It's one of them was to have a meditation as a creative catalyst for poetry and have a guided meditation with someone who is certified in that to do a creative process with meditation. The second one was Apraxis. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it's the art of writing poetry about paintings. The Poetry Fest, which is something that Anne and others had put together a few years ago. It was fantastic. That will require probably more funding and more time and no COVID to do if we do that. Another was, and I'll let Anne in on this, the Highway Haiku and the Poetry Post, which are ongoing projects. Anne, you want to speak to those?
Sure, I'll start with Highway Haiku, which was Hida von Bendy and Winberry, God bless her soul, started it in 2001. And their idea was everybody's speeding toward the ferry boat. Why not put up haiku, 3 placards over to the right side of the road to slow people down, and especially for wind, to give them a point of joy as they waited in line for the ferry that may or may not come. So over time, in the 50s, when we would travel around, I guess the West, there'd be something called Burma shave signs, and they'd have 1, 2, 3 lines of a jingle about, shave with Burma shave. And so the highway placards, the 3 placards, are sort of modeled on that. It went along fine, but the rods, the posts that held the placards would get pulled up, and we just said, oh, they really love those haiku. But after a while, it sort of got irritating. So George and Chip Wright stepped up, and with metal rods, put the sign holders up, so nobody, not even the freshest, most vigorous person can pull those things up. And another thing, Wynn would take the placards and she would choose the haiku, and she would calligraphy them beautifully, just beautifully. And every once in a while, she'd say, I got to buy some more of those things. I put 1 letter to the editor in the Beachcomber and said, we need some cash. Send it to, this post office box number. Within a week, we got $600. And I thought, oh, okay. Now, before Wynn went on to her reward, she agreed that Mike Feinstein would serve as editor, and Suzanne Moore, who recently left the island to move to Arizona, she is a calligraphy, and she's known not only for individual pieces of visual art, but that she illustrated some pages in the St. John's Bible out of Scotland. So, should I do the poetry post now, Sandra?
Yeah.
Okay. Years ago, I went to Yakima to interview the poet and publisher of Blue Begonia Press, Jim Bodine. And when I took many things away, one thing I took away was the idea of having a pole. He had a pole, and it was the mother pole. So I named, when I thought, well, we should have one here on Vashon, I named it a post. And so I decided I would be the solo person who would do this. So first I went to Lawrence Center. I need a cedar post. He says, you need one 12 feet long, 4 feet in the ground and 8 feet above, which is good because people have tried with a chain and a truck, I assume, to pull that post out of the village green. So as we were leaving, I said, how much do I owe you? Or he says, you don't have enough money. I said, okay. So I had met Zach Krieger at in Yakima at a Blue Begonia event, and he became my partner. Bill Ferris of Raven Isle Woodworks carved poetry post on the face of the pole, and Mr. Mars, I probably have known him, not known him, but heard of him. I have no idea what his first name is because he was of the generation where you always said Mr. Mars, Mr. Fisher. But Mr. Mars, thank goodness, had a tractor. So with a hook and a line, after Zach had preserved the cedar, he hung it and took the poetry post all the way down Vashon Highway from Cemetery Road to the Village Green. And I did go around and I asked the parks, can I do this? And they said, ask Vic of Vashon Island Growers Association. They said yes, no meetings. I like that. And so Mr. Mars brought the post down. He dug a hole and we planted that poetry post. And Paul Modioshi, a poet, did a blessing, and we toasted with cups of green tea the poetry post at the exact moment of winter solstice in 2006. And I want to invite everybody to either come by and read some poems, post some poems, either your own or your favorites. So that's my ad, Sandra. Thank you.
All right, and the rest are just basically a few more ideas. One was having the Washington State Poet Laureate Rena Priest visit, and we hope to be able to do that when we have a venue that will work to have her come. And then the Artists in the Schools program, there might dovetail some poetry into that program when they are able to have artists back in the schools. And that's pretty much it for the list as far as viable possibilities.
Oh, just Bruce Holman pointed out that we should also mention and define the other groups on the island outside that are working presently in bringing poetry to the community. And so the first one I want to mention is Mukai Farm and Garden. They have an annual haiku festival, 2020, 2021. This year, there was 280 submissions from all over the world. Every one is laminated and posted, some on the side of the fruit barreling plant, some in those wooden crates that when you picked strawberries, you would move from bush to bush, and the wooden berry carriers with the handles. And so that's 2 years, and they've gotten that much attention. Open Space for Arts and Community, O-Space as we know it, did what had happened in the 1970s when Don Barry moved to the island and he secured some CETA grants. Must have been a recession at that time. And he put out an anthology of Vashon poets. And I assume that we all got some money for appearing in that. Well, O-Space during COVID gave grants to artists at work, and one of the sub-programs was called the Literary Project. And you can go on their website, the O-Space website, and read. It's either 6 or 7 volumes, postings, and they are wonderful. Tom Twixma is one of the first ones, and Janie Starr sort of open the anthology. And speaking of ekphrastika, whatever that word is, which means that you get inspiration from looking at a piece of art, Vashon Center for the Arts had 2 poetry exhibits where poets were inspired by local visual artists' work. And then the other one was visual artists were inspired by poems. And one of them was called Lexicon of Light, curated by Lanera Lucas and Michael Alenko. So that's that. Okay, Tom, I throw it back to you.
Thank you. This is really interesting, how much of this activity is going on Vashon. And I thought I knew the literary scene to some extent, but I've learned several things tonight, and I hope folks out there are learning and getting excited about these things too. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about private groups meetings for poetry and workshops. You mentioned that quickly, but could you hit that a little more, please?
Sure. I think in today's paper, Bruce Hallman has in the history column, the little square to the left on one of the inner pages, about a couple, I'm going to make this guess, sorry, Bruce, in the 20s, 1923, that had art evenings, and part of the art evenings, besides music, was poetry. And that tradition still goes on. There are groups, long, short groups that meet to bring their poems. Usually once a month, they bring their poems and they sit and they listen to each other's poems and enjoy the poems, pick out where there's some ambiguity maybe, or whether the second or third stanza ought to fly away, or whatever. That particular group's personality will determine how the work is looked at. So one group I've been in for 25 years is Highway Haiku, started by Helen Russell. She was too old to work her bonsai trees anymore. So she started a haiku group, and she was still in it when she was 102. And she dared to leave us. One thing that these groups do is that they occasionally publish anthologies. The haiku group published 2 anthologies, but they're pretty much kept within us. But Margaret Ranconi and Sandra Noel and a third person from Seattle just published a work called 3 Birds Dreaming, and it's a book, and it's at the Vashon bookstore. Laura Lipman from another group has just had Washington State University, their new imprint, Basalt Books, published Writing Well Masked. And Barbara Gustafson and Laurie Stewart published maybe last year, the year before, Heart of Vashon, Sharing Our Stories in Pictures and Words. And from, this is a social action group led, I think, by other people, but Janie Starr as editor, Voices from the Verge, valiant meeting the challenges of homelessness, mental and economic challenges. And there was another one, but it'll come up. So I think that the groups keep bringing everybody that wants to be a poet. And you'll find if you just stand up and say, I'm a poet, people believe you and they will include you. And you will enter into a group where other people who are looking at the craft of poetry as well as the content. And those are great moments to have over time.
I just want to mention real quick that third person on 3 Birds, her name is Joanna Conham.
Oh, thank you.
She's third bird. And we've been writing a poem a day since 2012, every day.
That's wonderful.
It's insane.
That's amazing. I was wondering if these resources that you all are mentioning could be posted perhaps on one of your websites or both your websites, or coordinated with the Heritage Museum, because
Oh, sure.
there's a lot of information that I personally would like to dig into a little deeper. Our time is moving along, and this being an event through the Heritage Museum, I was wondering if we could go back in time a little bit and talk about poetry on Vashon Island before the Poet Laureates program began. And I know, Sandra, you have a particular passion for one very famous, well-known artist poet who spent some time on Vashon. And would you like to tell us a little bit about Ferlinghetti's time here and the poems he wrote? Or I think it was just one poem, wasn't it?
It was one poem, and I remember Jack Corso. I know some of the people listening, I know Ann does, and he told me about this actually when I first moved to the island, and the two of us drinking port wine late one night, howling at the moon, I believe, when I first moved here. And it was also a recent article with Bruce Haldeman and Terry Donnelly for the Beachcomber in 2021 about his visit. And he was a friend of Jack Corso's. And he wrote this poem. He was over here visiting Jack, and then he did a little reading at Al and Tony's Pizza. And this poem is actually very relevant today, especially with climate change and everything that's going on. And the title of the poem is called Clamshell Alliance. Here by the sea, Vashon Island, Puget Sound, at the portage, lie in bed, thinking what to do. The sea is calm tonight, beneath it, all not so calm, nor inside us here at the isthmus, this portage between two lives, this isthmus built on Indian arrowheads, all not so calm. We are all submerged in our lives in the bath of creation, yet the tide is full. The small clams and quilting oysters are their own alliance against the world's defeat. They are in league with the seas and the whales. They are in league with Moby Dick against the Ahabs of the earth. The clams live and breathe, closed up. We too, close up tight on shore, clam up.
Tom, I can talk about another, beginning almost of poetry on the island, and it's through the historic newspapers. Right now, the Beachcomber does a great job. I once wrote an article for them because they do reviews of the new books coming out about islanders. When Leslie Brown was editor, I said, I'm writing in my articles just so long. She says, pretend you're writing for the New Yorker. And I think with COVID and the smallness of the staff, they carry on that tradition. But the reviews are wonderful. They're specific, they're insightful, and Liz Shepard does a great job. Well, Mike Suddeth over the years has been feeding me poetry from the island newspapers. And so one newspaper was Vashon Island News Record, which ran from 1918 to 1942. And the editor was Agnes Smock. And as I look at these poems, it's the same topics that we are worried about today. Locally, it's the ferry. Starting from the very beginning, it was, oh, we really welcome settlers. And then we moved over to stay away. And most recently, if you, well, not in the 90s, if you're from California, don't come. You know, so that's still there. Taxes, government services, teens, roads, all of those, and love and spring and odes to the wonders of Vashon. So there's one called Strawberry, and I'm going to read just the first stanza. This is by P. Smock, and it was on the radio. How dear to my heart is the Vashon strawberry. when ripened from vines sprung from Vashon Island soil. The sunshine has kissed it. The sea breeze has wooed it. It reaches perfection with minimum toil. The innocent blush of its virginal beauty is spread from its heart to the surface we see. The odor of heaven surrounds every berry to win the affection of poets like me. Another one, and I want to note that this poem by Norman Edson has missed, because he lived a long time ago, sensitivities that poets nowadays are attending to. One is you don't steal anybody else's face. That is, you don't steal or speak for the other race, the other culture within your poetry. The other thing is that you don't use stereotypes. And there's something called Tontoism. Lone Ranger had a sidekick who was Native American, and he spoke without any articles. It was sort of weird. And Hollywood continued that. So with apologies for the use of the derogative term for Indian women Siwash, I will read this by Norman Edson. The Sky Canoe. Dark green furs and waters blue, a Siwash squash and a black canoe. An Indian stands at a teepee door, high on the side at a tide-swept shore. He stands and stares with lifted eyes at a silvered ship that swiftly flies without a sail across the skies. Huh? White man makes some magic new. He sailed the sky in gas canoe. So to clear the air, before I turn it back to Tom, in 2008 at a low tide festival, Mike Evans, who was captaining the Snohomish canoe, the Blue Heron, came to us and said, I'm going to give you your song. This is a gift. I'm going to give you your song. And when the canoes come in, they usually come towards the shore, and they'll run parallel to the shore and then come back, so the people on the shore can identify them and decide whether they want to welcome them or not. So this is the welcome song. I'll only read a little bit of it, and my Schwabach is not very good. Tasalisi, talalasi, talalasi, ti ato, tal, bu. And so then there's 2 verses and 2 more verses, and then a turnaround, which is a finish and double time drums. So this is what Bill Evans gave us, a poetry from indigenous people to the island. So thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to give a quick thanks to Frank Bolinas, who's out there, who has posted in the chat room a link to a Beachcomber article, a very nice Beachcomber article, as I recall, on Lawrence Ferlinghetti's time on Vashon. And Sandra, of course, we're grateful to her for reading one of Ferlinghetti's poems about and on Vashon. It's a kind of one of those extraordinary moments where culturally well-received poet happens to be here and doing this kind of work and inspiring and carrying on the tradition really of lots of other poets like the two of you. I was wondering if either of you wants to read a work of your own poetry now before we move into questions from folks. You should feel free to decline if you care.
Oh, okay. Tom, while I'm looking for my poem, I do want to mention the Puget Sound Chautauqua Assembly, which in 1888 was in full bloom on Vashon Island. It was started back east in 1877. It's the Chautauqua movement, and Ellisport had a celebration of the Chautauqua which happened, like I said, in 1888 down at Ellisport. And when people arrived, I mean, there was 150 permanent sites like Ellisport with hotels. There was a 1,200 seat pavilion. There was a floating dock, campfires, songs, lectures, science, humanities, poetry, drama, went on, and people came for a weekend, a week, and enjoyed this incredible movement all the way across the United States. And the other one is Marjorie Stanley. How can we miss Marjorie Stanley? She was active on Vashon from 10 years old to about the 1960s. She was born in say 1900 and so on. And she wrote the, I don't have it here, but her volume, which can be bought at the Heritage Museum, is History, Sometimes Hysterical Rhymes, some of Vashon Poet Island. They're poems. So if you're in a small community, beach community, and you want to know what they did for the 4th of July, or who is dating whom, or the stories that nobody knows, she has those in those poems. And being a poet of her day, they have full rhyme, and they just trot right along. And so I have a short one. 'Twas back. This is unidentified flying laughter, post duty. It's during World War II, where there's women on the island who looked for Japanese planes. I'll just read one stanza. 'Twas back in 1942, we served at Army posts. Our post was Maury's old graveyard, a home for haunting ghosts. Bertie Chapman was my partner, curvaceous and oh so funny. I called her quite facetiously my rotund funny bunny. And then the poem goes on and ends. The war was won. We grieve for boys lost forever after. But those with memories sad, I hear bunny's cheery laughter. So now we get to read, Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you for that additional background. It is sort of extraordinary to realize that there was this rich cultural life when Vashon was very different than it is now. And we sometimes forget that other world and how rich it was in our rush around today, and even including our cultural works. Sandra, would you like to read something, or are you?
I'd be happy to. Just this, I have one poem. It's from the book Love Island, and I do love this island. And most of the poetry in this book are about Vashon. And this one is called Return Again. It was actually a friend of mine passed away on Lummi Island not long ago, and it was read at her. We went there to scatter her ashes, and it was read at that moment. It's called Return Again. Save me the dried apples. Save me the sweet jam made from last summer's blackberries, or I will return again, always to this island, where light silvers over the wide bay, morning and evening, and wild voices call me awake and to sleep. From the trees and the open air, I will always return, even as bones and dust, to rest at last by this quiet shore. You got one, Ann? I know you do.
Okay. This is from Backcut, 1946 or 7. Washington State, the dialogues, husband and wife speaking. And he is just home from Europe. He has addictions. They did clams for a reading, and she is slowly moving back into the great woods and ocean. So this is wife, she's speaking. Visiting. On the kitchen table, sake warm in a tin cup, with an opium chaser brewed from her garden's poppies, fluttering black hearts, pods milk green, She asked me to deflate the rising bread dough. She returns all favors, a twig with glowy lichen bumping its wet bark, a long borrowed book, oysters breaded and fried in a lake of good butter. She returns my lost coat, its buttons tightened, heavier thread, smarter knot, an almost matching button, replaced the lost one, in and out stitches, making a cross. Filling the window, her garden twists into a gentle mass. Vines kneel, scarlet runner beans abandoning the string, fraying on the straight up rose. She says, I can do nothing else for you. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Well, those were both very, very powerful pieces. Thank you. We're now moving into folks asking any questions of our panelists. And Chris, as I understand it, they can just ask their questions in the chat room. And I see we already have one question. I think it's from Bruce and Pam Hallman, asking me to ask our panelists, why is poetry important for a community like Vashon? What does poetry do that other forms of writing don't do? Great question.
I can give it a shot.
Please.
What does it do that other forms of writing do not do? It doesn't, I don't think that's a question that you can really answer that easily. Different forms of writing, if someone writes a story, say, or a short story, or even a novel about a place like this, that's one way of kind of describing a community, creating a world where that community is part of it, if it's fiction. Poetry is much more condensed, I think, in terms of what is being presented. To me, it's a very short form of a big picture. And I remember Langston Hughes' poem about how, I think he said it was the soul condensed, drop by drop. I mean, it just has this way of taking a big idea and making it very, very much a nucleus of a place. And Anne, what do you think?
I think that fiction writers depend upon handing you the book. And the grace of poets is that they're individuals. They do come together as a group, but they hand their poem from themselves to another individual. And being on this island with our steady population of 10,000 people, we still recognize who our poets are. And we ask them about poetry, even those who are not poets. We know what they sound like. I think it's because it's individuals within this closed community, so to speak, because there's the fairies. And I also think that even though people misunderstand that anybody who has a language can write in poetry, because as Sandra says, it's a distillation, and it's a distillation coming from one person, and you both hear and learn, but you also relive it. And I think that that's it's always enjoyable to meet someone who can speak well. And that doesn't mean that you have to go to college. It doesn't mean that you have to start when you're 6 years old. And it doesn't mean like you have to sound like the other poet or the neighbor poet. You just have to sound like yourself. That's why I think Vashon likes to sound like itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way poetry can distill a mood in a community historically, and the way it also can affirm to a community what its values are. I'm thinking, doing what I do for a living, I'm thinking historically of the role of Walt Whitman in American history, American poetic history, and the extraordinary way he would condense moments for people, and they'd say, ah, yes, that is how I feel. Is another question in the chat room. thanking both of you for the evening and asking both of you in 10 to 20 years from now, what would be your dream for poetry on the island? Thanks for that great question, Catherine Johnson.
Catherine, I hope it's like it is now. But I hope that everybody knows how to access it, not by buying a book necessarily, but by writing and speaking. I just hope that the energy keeps on. I mean, maybe I'm too much in the center to know what's way out there. I think that we're doing a great job. Sandra?
Yeah, I agree. I also, well, in 10 to 20 years, I hope I'm still here and we can continue seeing poetry grow on the island, seeing young people. We had some young people come to the VOB readings, and we've had young people show up at the open mics, and it's so great to hear them and to know that they are carrying this on too from their perspective. They have a lot to say about what's going on with climate change and COVID and just how their lives are going to be in the next 10 to 20 years. So the young people, the young poets.
And that's one of the bad things about COVID is that we became so tight, I mean, and frantic to get the present poet laureate out there, and the schools were closed and the teachers had just so much to do and the students had so much to do that we didn't have a teen poet laureate these 2 years. So that's which we have had for every, two years in the past. And it would have been a better conversation tonight if there was a square with a teen poet in it.
Yeah. Another quick question is, either of you been inspired ever by a work of art to write and make that connection between the visual and the verbal?
The Vashon Center for the Arts, tell me if I already talked about this, had two calls for poets and writers. So usually not. I like my things moving around. Sandra?
I am an artist, an illustrator. That's my job. And so I am inspired to write about art. I've got some, I don't have them on hand right now, but I do occasionally write, especially people like Rembrandt. I wrote one about Rembrandt's monkey. I don't have it with me, but about how he put his dead monkey in a portrait. He did do that in the family, and they asked him to paint it out and he wouldn't do it. But I spend as much time as I can in the Seattle Museum. Just someday, whenever I'm in the city, I try to at least go by there for some time, because there's something about that energy of the old masters. They're my favorite. As an illustrator, I'm drawn to realism, although Monet is my favorite artist, so that's not totally true. But yeah.
Besides visual art, Michael Tracy did at the Vashon Center for the Arts, did a series where he would talk about, but bring in a pianist, and that's Liszt. I listened to that at Vashon Center for the Arts. And it was just, I never really listened to piano before. I mean, aside from, the Catholic education part of it, of getting it, but it inspired me so much that the wife in this 1947 post-World War II revisits a piano that's been in a logger baron's house and not played, and it's been tuned, and she plays this song, and she plays Liszt. And I had to call Michael and say, oh, you have to look at this. Am I saying that they press and release? She presses and releases the petals at the same time when she's supposed to. And he corrected the poem a little bit for me. Oh, yes. You know, I was too offhand about not being inspired by other art.
Thank you. Yeah, another quick question is coming up. How can islanders interested in developing their poetry skill get involved and connected with island poets? You mentioned some of the groups around here working. Can you distill that down to a quick little blurb about what people can do to get connected?
One thing I can just mention would be the open mics, and if this individual wants to be on that list, just get in touch with me. And is there a way I could just type in my email, right? For them?
Yes, in the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna do that, and then Anne, you go, because that's a question for you, I think.
One thing, for the haiku group, people wanted to join the haiku group, but we had 10 to 12 and nobody left unless they went to the other side, right? And because it was so good. But what we offered was, if you want to get a group together, like 3 people, even 2 people, you could ask me, you could maybe Sandra or somebody else, Susan Lynch, to come and meet you once. And everybody bring poems and sort of get, it would be your only led meeting. And it would give you some of the ways to successfully address each other's poems. Because Sandra and I have done it for a long time. But you know, you could call upon somebody already in a group to come and be with your group for your first session. And then you'll move on to your own personality and your own ways of being comfortable with each other. Boy, if it ever opens up, come to a poetry reading and sit next to somebody. You know, just sit next to somebody and talk and say, do you know of anybody? And hand them your email address. And then, you know, over time, someone will give you a call, or start your own.
Start your own. I like it. Grow your own. A very Vashon idea. Sandra has posted her email address for anyone to get in contact with her about any more getting involved in open mic. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. It's like trying to walk and chew gum, which I've never been good at. Rose O'Brien mentions the young island poet Iris Dawn, who holds poetry workshops and has info on Facebook, so you might want to try to get in touch with Iris. One more question from Catherine. Who are a couple of your favorite poets who inspire you?
For me, it would be Mary Oliver, who passed on not long ago. I love nature poetry, and that's kind of where I'm comfortable writing. And Spiers.
Oh, thank you, Sandra.
No, it's true.
And I have never met, I'll return a compliment, a person who at a certain point decided to be a poet and to write poetry. And Sandra, you are just a racing meteor where you have come. And I appreciate it, having read your books and being your companion and peer in this. Probably my favorite poet is Robert Sun, a student of Theodore Retke.
Yeah.
And Theodore Retke turned to him and said, you know, Robert, just go write poetry. And he did. He spent quite a few years at Shy Beach. When poets and other people had dropped out in the 70s, 60s and 70s and built shacks. His poetry is distilled. You know, the yellow velvet near the blue water. I mean, it's just, I find it beautiful. And I think that he is the first, the purest, and to me, the most instructive way to be. I wish I could be in the world the way he was, but I like a warm house. But writing poetry that it's not haiku, but like haiku, it brings the image and the emotion that has to deal with nature right to you. So you have this sort of mystical moment.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. I think you're both connecting into, from what you're saying, a longer, larger tradition beyond Vashon to the Northwest, and some of the great poets of the Northwest, like Retke and Sund. Sund getting much less attention than he deserves. I agree with you. And Retke getting a lot of attention, which he certainly deserves. We've reached the 8 o'clock point. Chris, how are we doing? Are we wrapping up here?
Here, I think I'm back. Yeah, this is, unless anybody's got a quick question, yeah, this is about the time we wrap it up. So I think with no more questions, I'd like to thank Ann and Sandra for sharing their interesting perspectives. And thank you, Tom, for moderating tonight's topic. And of course, thank you to everybody for joining us for this museum talk. This presentation has been recorded, and you can find it on the Vashon Heritage website in a couple of days, a week or so. Takes a little time to get it up there. So without further ado, I'd say good night and thank you again.